Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis, or IEFA, as we call ourselves, for our latest webinar on LNG. Today, we're excited to have three analysts present from three different regions on how the rapid expansion of North American LNG exports stresses the continent's gas system, how that impacts the Asian markets, and how Europe's reliance on LNG imports risks to energy security. Presenting today, we have Clark Williams-Derry from our North America team. Clark's work focuses on the finances of North America's oil and gas industry. His areas of expertise include North American LNG exports, global LNG market trends, the long-term financial performance of North American oil and gas companies, particularly fracking-focused enterprises, and financial issues related to the cleanup of oil and gas infrastructure. Next up, we will have Sam Reynolds from our Asia team. Sam focuses on the economic, financial, and climate risks associated with natural gas and LNG infrastructure developments in Asia. He is the author of several studies concerning the region's transition to renewable energy, stranded asset risk in the natural gas sector, and the macroeconomic risk associated with a greater regional dependence on imported LNG. Finally, we have Anna Maria Jaller-Markowitz from our Europe team. Anna Maria's research focuses on topics related to gas and LNG, as well as other relevant European energy issues. Anna Maria is an international energy consultant with more than 25 years of experience in power and natural gas markets and industry. We'll have about 30 to 35 minutes of presentations, and then we'll take questions using the Q&A function. As you probably saw, this is being recorded, and we will share the recording afterward as well. There are a lot of people joining us today, so if we don't get to all of the questions, you can feel free to reach out to us afterwards, and we'll do the best we can following up with everyone. And with that, we will hand it over to Clark to get us started.
Sounds good. Can folks hear me okay? And let's see. Have I shared my screen successfully? Can I get a thumbs
Yep,
up?
you're good.
Okay, people see it. Great, fabulous. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for
Clark, I think
this.
there's a couple things being shared, not just the presentation.
Hmm, all right, so let me go ahead back for a second. Stop share. Let me try one more time. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your patience. Is this right? You got it
Perfect.
now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Thanks for the putting up with it or bearing with us during the technical glitch. My name is Clark. I am an analyst with IEEFA, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, and welcome to this introduction to IEEFA's North American LNG tracker. The tracker is available on our website at IEEFA.org, or you can find it on Google by searching for North American LNG export tracker. Or you can also use this URL that I have down here at the bottom. The goal of this project is really to help visualize key trends affecting North America's LNG industry. We wanted to create maps and charts that would bring the data to life and to give some national and international context to LNG projects that folks are working on or experiencing or dealing with in their own backyards. So rather than spending this time together, taking you through the website, I thought I'd just walk you through some of the high-level conclusions, the key takeaways that we reached while doing the research on the tracker. And I'm going to focus on these four things. First is something that a lot of folks on this call probably know very well already, that North America's LNG export industry is growing very rapidly. It has grown rapidly over the past decade, and it is continuing to grow probably at even a faster clip right now. The second issue that we wanted to bring to the fore is that exports, gas exports, LNG exports are starting to create stresses for North American gas consumers, for the gas system in North America. Many folks, residences, businesses, industries, electric utilities are facing higher and more volatile prices. As we're exporting gas, we're importing price volatility. The third thing we wanted to highlight is the growing reliance of the U.S. LNG industry, North America's LNG industry, on Europe, which, as Anna will discuss later, creates some stresses not only for the LNG industry in the U.S., but also for Europe itself. And then finally, wanted to point out the slow progress that has been made in developing new LNG export facilities on the Pacific coast, specifically, particularly in Mexico and Canada. So starting here with the growth of exports in North America. It was almost exactly a decade ago, in February of 2016, that the first LNG cargo left the Gulf of U.S. Gulf Coast. Since then, the United States has moved from being a bit player in the overall LNG market to the largest single exporter of LNG in the world, with about a quarter of all LNG traded last year coming from North America, from the United States in particular. Uh, the U.S. was actually the top exporter in both 23 and 2024, but was as a narrow lead. We were sort of basically sort of neck and neck with Australia and Qatar. But in 2025, the U.S. pulled ahead and became far and away the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And that's just going to continue. This is a chart showing the build out of LNG export capacity over time in North America. In North America. This is where we wound up at the end of 2025. And through about 2030, we're going to see a rough doubling of export capacity. At the end of 25, we had perhaps 125 to 130 million tons of LNG export capacity in North America. That will probably exceed 2030. By 2030, it'll exceed about 250 million tons of capacity. This schedules it what we've projected here. It may slip a little bit. Some of these projects may come on a little bit later than we've shown here, but certainly by within the next 5 to 7 years, we are going to see a massive increase in LNG export capacity here in North America. Now, this is, of course, in the context of an overall industry that is growing very fast. The US and North America are going to be contributing roughly a majority, about a little over 50% of total export capacity that's under construction around the world right now. But we have plenty of competitors. There are plenty of other places that are building LNG projects, from Qatar to Australia and Argentina and Malaysia and Mozambique, and Oman, UAE, Russia, Nigeria, Indonesia. This is a global build out that we're part of, and it is going to result in the biggest new addition of LNG export capacity in the history of the LNG industry, for all time. This next few years are going to we're going to see a massive increase in new capacity, new shipments, and we're just going to have to see how that plays out in the markets, as essentially we believe that there's going to be a glut that develops with too much LNG capacity and potentially not enough demand. Geographically, the North America's LNG industry is concentrated on the Gulf Coast, both in the U.S. and in Mexico. In Mexico, the single operating project right now is on the Gulf Coast, although there's one that's going to be opening up on the Pacific Coast probably in 2026. So this also shows the plants under construction. What we see again between operating plants and plants under construction, it's the Gulf Coast that is the dominant player in the LNG industry. Places outside the Gulf Coast are developing some LNG terminals. There's a few on the east coast of the U.S. There's one on the west coast of Canada right now, and a few more opening up on the west coast in the near future. But the Gulf dominates, and there's reasons for that, historical reasons, geologic and geographic reasons. There is plenty of gas supply in the Gulf region, from the Permian, from the Eagle Ford, from the Haynesville, from other fracking basins in nearby states. There's a lot of gas infrastructure in these places. They have a trained workforce that can build LNG plants fairly inexpensively or comparatively inexpensively, although costs are rising. And they have existing infrastructure, pre-existing infrastructure, pipelines, deep water terminals, even some import terminals that were turned into export terminals. So there's a reason why the Gulf sort of dominates the North America's LNG picture because there's so much gas and so much infrastructure already in existence. That's just not true on the Pacific coast of Mexico or of British Columbia. So moving on to the stresses that exports are placing on the North American gas system. This is a chart showing the different uses of natural gas in the United States, from homes and businesses, industrial users, electricity. But increasingly, what we're seeing grow and grow fastest is LNG exports and also, to a lesser extent, pipeline exports into Mexico. At this point, exports are a larger uh, destination for U.S. gas than all buildings in that is residences and commercial businesses, not industrial industries and industrial facilities, but for exports, we're exporting more than all of our homes and businesses use. What this means is that when export demand rises, when there's a spike in demand for exports, this can now filter into the prices that are paid by all consumers in North America, particularly in the US and Mexico, which have a very tightly interconnected gas system. So when demand for exports rises, when there's a spike in demand, you can see a spike in prices. And we've already experienced that at least twice now. The first time was during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. This created turmoil in Europe's gas markets and set off a bidding war for limited supplies of LNG around the globe. Um, Domestic prices in North America skyrocketed to the highest levels in a decade directly because of the pressure that LNG exports were putting on domestic gas supplies. Essentially, domestic consumers are in a bidding war, in a price war with wealthy Asian and European buyers for the same gas has pushed prices up to all-time highs. Not all-time highs, but highs since the beginning of the fracking. Then more recently, we've seen a weather-related price spike that where LNG terminals were still continuing to operate when domestic consumers of gas would have been desperate for a little additional gas in the gas system. Instead of reserving the gas for domestic users, the gas was exported, and this contributed to, didn't cause, but it contributed to the price spikes we saw in net wholesale gas prices in North America earlier this year. Moving on to the growing dependence of the U.S. LNG export industry on Europe. In the early phases of North America's export boom, the U.S. predominantly shipped its LNG to Asia and to the Americas. It was really Asia in particular that was seen as the main long-term destination for U.S. LNG because it was believed that that was where the demand was going to be materialized. That energy-hungry Asian economies were going to need more and more LNG, and so the U.S. LNG industry had positioned itself to supply Asia predominantly by going through the Panama Canal, but also around Africa or through the Suez Canal to get to Asian markets. But starting in about 2021 and then sort of accelerating in 22 and beyond, the US LNG industry increasingly found a home for its wares in Europe. At this point, about two-thirds of U.S. LNG is shipped to Europe, and that is, again, expected to continue for some time with this rising dependence on Europe as the main buyer of LNG produced in the U.S. And it's not just one terminal or a few terminals. It is a fairly widespread phenomenon with essentially every single LNG terminal in North America, with the exception of LNG Canada on the west coast of Canada, that now relies on Europe as a significant buyer of LNG. Now, of course, this creates some risks for the LNG industry. If Europe, for example, decides that it doesn't want to buy as much LNG from the US, then, well, they're going to have to figure out a new system and a new supply chain and new buyers elsewhere in the world. And Anna can talk a little bit more about some of the security issues in energy security issues in Europe. Final point to sort of bring this home is there's an, a continued interest in the LNG industry to develop new export facilities on the west coast of Canada and Mexico to supply buyers in Asia. Uh, the passage through the Panama Canal has grown increasingly unreliable due to climate change and the lowering of the water levels in Lake Gatun, which is one of the key suppliers of water for the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal actually goes through Lake Gatun through part of its length. So with challenges in getting shipments through the Panama Canal and increasing congestion, the U.S. and North American industry increasingly sees uh, new terminals on the west coast of Canada and the west coast of Mexico as sort of their sort of pipeline to Asia. But the problem is that a lot of these projects are facing severe delays and cost overruns. This is a chart showing the cost escalation that was seen in what's called the Coastal GasLink pipeline that leads from a British Columbian fracking basin called the Montney Basin in northeastern British Columbia to the coast. Originally, it was projected to cost $4 billion this pipeline. By when all was said and done, it cost $14.5 billion Canadian. This cost escalation was largely borne by the pipeline company itself, which had to write off somewhere around $5 billion worth of its investments, wiping out its profits for several years. Similar projects, similar cost inflation is happening in the wood fiber LNG project. This is a relatively small project in Squamish, British Columbia, which has seen its cost estimates escalate from somewhere around 1.4 to 1.8 billion dollars when it was first proposed in 2015, up to the current estimate of about 12.2 billion dollars Canadian that was released last August. So this is actually part of a larger pattern we've seen in Canada with lots of new proposals that have been uh, floated with permits that have been issued and export licenses that have been issued, but have kind of gone nowhere. They've stalled out. There are still several projects that are under construction in Canada, but we've seen a lot of desire by the Canadian gas industry to develop these terminals, but not a lot of success and some real challenges in making these projects come to life. So I'm going to just stop there and pass things on to Sam to discuss some of the trends that he's seeing with US LNG in Asia and Asian demand.
Awesome. Thanks, Clark. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. It should be able to see that. So Sam Reynolds here. I lead the gas and LNG research for the IEEFA Asia team. And I'm going to start here by just painting a quick picture of what Asian LNG demand looked like in 2025. And imports were down 5% across the region. That's the steepest annual decline since 2022. What clearly stands out here is China, a decline of 15% in its LNG imports. And I'm going to talk more about China in the coming slides. In the JKT markets of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, we see a mixed picture. Japanese imports have declined steadily from a peak way back in 2014. Meanwhile, Taiwan recently shuttered its last remaining nuclear facility, causing an uptick in LNG imports. Looking at the price-sensitive markets of South and Southeast Asia, we don't exactly get a picture of health. Demand was down in the key markets of India, Thailand, and Pakistan. And what's important is that the LNG industry and policymakers in North American export markets have really framed China and India as bastions for growth. They're often framed as kind of this endless sponge able to absorb any new LNG supplies. Never mind the fact that in both countries, LNG demand in 2025 was lower than it was in 2020. So I'm going to talk about these two countries going forward. Before I do, I'll look very quickly at what prices are doing in the various European and Asian spot prices. There's a lot to say here about the interaction between these two benchmarks, but I think for our purposes, what's important is that LNG prices have been declining since very extreme highs in 2022. And yet still Asian demand in 2025 remains quite weak. So what's happening, right? And starting with China. After years of just very rapid, steady growth in LNG demand, what we've seen in China is that over the past 5 years, there's really been a shift, a fundamental change in China's approach to LNG procurement. And that begs the question of, well, what has changed over the past 5 years? The first thing that comes to mind is the extreme volatility in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which highlighted just how exposed China was to the roller coaster of global prices. Not to mention a fraught bilateral US-China relationship, which caused China's LNG imports of US LNG to fall to zero for all of last year, according to Kepler data. Now, as a result of these kind of extreme volatility and geopolitical changes, China has really started to re-emphasize the importance of its domestic self-sufficiency in energy security. And that's reflected in both its 14th and 15th 5-year plans. China has really ramped up its domestic gas output. This is an underappreciated story in the global LNG industry. Domestic output in China rising on rates of 6 to 10% per year, driven by unconventional shale and coal bed methane developments. Higher pipeline imports from Russia, the Power of Siberia 1 now operating at full capacity. So that means you have pipeline imports and cheaper domestic production now competing more directly with seaborne LNG imports. In the similar vein of domestic energy security, the renewables growth in China is just absolutely mind-boggling. I'm sure you all have seen stories. For the first time ever, China has more renewables capacity on its grid than fossil fuel capacity. Coal-fired power generation declined 1% last year for the first time in over a decade. And you have the markets now, the LNG industry promoting other markets like LNG trucking as a potential driver of growth here. Well, what we've seen is that battery electric vehicles for long-haul trucking have started to rapidly outpace new sales of LNG trucks. Battery electric trucks accounted for 54% of new truck sales in China. So that window of opportunity for other sectors can close very rapidly in a way that's often underappreciated by the LNG industry. When we look at what's happening in the power mix, you often hear claims that in China, LNG can displace coal. Well, that's simply not happening. Coal has remained flat at about a 3% share of China's power mix over the last decade. Renewables and like solar and wind are absolutely booming. Pivoting to India a bit, you see very similar trends. The Indian government has very ambitious targets to increase the share of gas in its overall energy mix. What we've found is that the share of gas in its energy mix is actually declining over the last decade. And similarly, in the power sector, the share of gas has declined quite rapidly to below 2% as of last year, with wind and solar moving in the opposite direction, taking on a larger and larger role. So what about the other sectors, right? That's power. Well, what we see in India is that the highly subsidized fertilizer sector accounts for almost all of the country's LNG demand growth. And in other sectors, that demand growth has been relatively limited, right? In the power sector, India has not built hardly any new power capacity, gas-fired power capacity over the last decade. It does not plan to build any new gas plants through 2032. Why is that? Well, 31 gas-fired power plants in India did not generate a single kilowatt hour of electricity in fiscal 2025. That's 8 gigawatts total of stranded power capacity. And estimates suggest prices would have to fall to between $6 and $7 below $6 to be competitive with coal and RE. Indian buyers have repeatedly said they need prices of $6 to $7 to be competitive throughout a range of economic sectors in the country. That's similar to what we're seeing in most other emerging markets as well, this inability of LNG to really price in to power generation. Now, I'm going to leave you with a few important thoughts here, a few questions. Yes, globally, LNG prices are expected to fall, and that may make it easier for these markets like China and India and other emerging players to import more. But it depends on what the benchmark is going to be. If they're linking to US gas prices, contracts from the US are indexed to Henry Hub, as Clark discussed. These prices have been extremely volatile. In January, prices surpassed $7. That's not even including the liquefaction costs, the shipping costs, the regasification costs. Just on Henry Hub alone, we see US LNG potentially being uncompetitive with other resources in Asian economies. For Canada and Mexico, they may not be linked to Henry Hub. They may be linked to ACO or the Waha Hub, but with the long-term construction schedules, the delays, and the cost increases, how is that going to affect the economics of those projects? Already throughout much of North America, seeing break-even prices higher than what Asian prices have said Asian buyers have said would be necessary. And then there's the elephant of Qatari LNG, large amounts of uncontracted supply there. Will that undermine the competitiveness of North American LNG and spot markets? Finally, what we've seen is that, again, demand windows in various sectors in Asia can close very, very rapidly. In China's power sector, in trucking sector, in India's power sector. And how are those windows going to change going forward? We think renewables have consistently been underappreciated. Technological disruptions have been consistently underappreciated. So that's going to continue to be a challenge for pricing in North American LNG to Asia. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Anna Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Let me just share it. Hello, good afternoon. I'm interested here on showing you what is happening in Europe. Yeah. So we have seen already that there's a lot of US LNG coming into Europe after the full invasion of Ukraine. When we were importing almost half of the gas from one source, now we are facing another dependency. Now Europe is relying on the US LNG imports the most. And that has created a little bit of uncertainty in the market. And the European Commission president is concerned about this. He's saying that we need to have a competitive Europe. And that can only be if you are independent. So the more we depend on fossil fuel imports from any source, the more likely we are going to be dependent on all these geopolitical issues that they don't offer us a security. So we have seen that the Russian gas was really important in 2021. We were saying that we were importing around 151 billion cubic meters from Russia. And at that moment, the US was 21. But the situation in 2025 is completely different. While we have reduced dependency on Russian gas, we have increased our dependency on US LNG. Our biggest also source of gas is Norway, but as we can see, has been more or less steady. So we have seen is a lot of increase here. And the increase from 21 in 2021 to 81 in 25, so almost 4 times. We noticed that also at this time, while we were importing more US LNG, we reduced gas imports, and that was quite important for Europe. We reduced by 20% the gas consumption. That helped that the imports didn't increase as we thought initially were going to increase, even though the US took a lot of portion of these imports. The Netherlands, France, Spain, Italy, and Germany, they are the main importers of US LNG. They account for almost 75%. 13 EU countries import US LNG. So we can see that there's a lot of dependency on different countries from the US LNG. And some countries are importing more than the 90% of all the import mix from the US, from only one source. And the US LNG is the most expensive for EU buyers. So it's not that we are buying a cheap fossil fuel, it's what is the most expensive one. We saw last year that even though we're increasing the dependency on US LNG, last year there was a big push to sign more LNG deals with the US. You know, we saw events like the Gas Tech, like the Partnership for Transatlantic Energy Cooperation. All of these, lots of countries in Europe were signing MOUs, heads of agreement, contracts with different US sellers. And what we have noticed is that if we lock into these long-term contracts, we are risking undermining our own autonomy, our own energy security, and the Green Deal program that we have already in place in Europe. If we, that was something that really caught my attention recently, is that if all these deals materialize, the ones that we saw that were discussed in 2025, if all these deals come into place, in 5 years' time, we will be importing 80% of our LNG from one source, the US. So it doesn't matter if it's the US, it's Russia, what we need in Europe is not to depend on one source. So if we see that we need to continue reducing gas consumption, if we don't continue reducing gas consumption, and if all these deals are going to come, we will be completely dependent on US LNG. If we that was just US LNG, but if we understand that we also import gas and LNG, right now 20% of the gas and LNG come from the US. If all these deals are going to materialize, we will be importing 40% from only one source, which that increases greatly our dependency and could even be bigger than our imports from Norway. We have seen here, this is part of the LNG tracker, the European one. And on this one, we can see how the import mix has changed in the years. We still see that US, Russia, and Qatar are the main importer, the main sources of LNG to Europe. But we have seen the change. We have seen how much the US LNG is increasing. Russia has been decreasing. Qatar has been a little bit increasing. So US is taking that part of the mix. We have also concerns because, as we said, the more we import LNG, the more we import geopolitical issues, economy, wars, also even the weather in other places of the world. So we have seen a little bit of concern with the Strait of Hormuz. So we know that the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of the global LNG transits through that route. And so if this is interrupted, we are going to interrupt 20% of the global LNG. In 2025, 11% of the LNG flows via the Strait of Hormuz were sent to Europe. So that could be a risky situation, and that's why Europe needs to really work harder or reduce LNG imports. And the most important thing is reduce gas consumption. We also know that the gas ban is coming into effect by the end of 2027. By the end of this year, we'll see the LNG contracts ban coming into place, and after that, the Russian gas ban too. So all the sources we have been with issues. The US LNG is an expensive LNG. We need to reduce dependency on LNG imports as a whole. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great. Susan, do we have questions coming in?
We sure do. We already have a lot of questions coming in. I will get us started. I'm sure we have about 25 minutes. And again, if we don't get to all of them, you can feel free to reach out to us. But we'll start with how does the US surge for gas-powered electricity for data centers fit into the picture of US LNG exports?
That is a great question. They are essentially compounding one another. That is, in the short term, what's really growing fastest in the U.S. In terms of in terms of gas demand, is exports. Last year, uh, actually, gas consumption in the U.S. power sector fell slightly as prices rose and as coal took some market share from gas. Um, but it was sort of a surprise. People think that okay, there's all this talk about data center demand, but what was actually happening last year was that we were not seeing growth in electricity demand for gas. The what was rising fastest was exports. Moving forward, we may be on a sort of a dual track where there's going to be increasing stress in the gas system created by new demand for power to fuel data centers and new demand from the LNG export terminals, which are themselves massive consumers of gas. They consume gas in order to liquefy the gas into LNG, that's the power source, and they also obviously move gas overseas. What we can expect to see as a result of this is essentially another demand center. It's kind of like sort of adding almost like another, I don't know, another continent of that wants access to North American gas. When I say another continent, what I mean is that just as we saw a bidding war between Asia, Europe, and North American consumers in the 21 and 22 when gas prices were skyrocketing, we may see another bidding war set up between data centers, sort of a high wealth pocket in North America, other consumers in North America, Europe, and Asia for the same limited supplies of domestic gas. So it's a fabulous question. I think that this is an issue where the because of rising or the potential for rising demand from data centers for natural gas and for electricity, you're going to see more volatile and prices, and that volatility that was already being created by U.S. LNG exports is going to be exacerbated by the tight supplies and the tight demand that is created by data center uh, growth in data center demand for electricity.
Great. Thank you, Clark. Look for another question. We have a couple Canada-focused questions. So we do have Mark Collega on the call with us as well, who follows Canada very closely. So I'm hoping that he can chime in on this one. Are Canadian LNG prices projected to still be lower than US LNG prices? I understand economically the cost is high for Canadians, government, and the supplier. I'm curious about clarification for strictly the buyers.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think regarding prices, for cargoes coming out of Canada, I think, and any of the panelists can chime in. I think ultimately these are determined by the contract between the terminal and the end user or the buyer. And that ultimate price is influenced by the terms of the contract, the destination of where that LNG is headed to. So I don't think there is a black or white answer to or a general price for cargoes coming out of Canada. But what we do know is that the terminals on the BC coast have their gas linked to the AECO hub in Alberta, that area, and these generally trade at a discount to Henry Hub on the Gulf Coast. And if these cargoes are going to Asia due to proximity, there might be some shipping discounts as well. So one might expect maybe these contracts to be priced maybe more competitively than cargoes coming out of the Gulf Coast, but ultimately it depends on what contract is signed and between what parties.
Can I just jump in and say there's a lot of confusion about price and cost. So the price that Canadian LNG will receive in the market will be determined by contracts, whether it's a spot contract, whether it's with a long-term contract, who's the buyer, like a lot of other things. But the thing to remember is that the cost of LNG from Canada is actually fairly high. Even though gas is relatively cheap, the projects themselves tend to be very expensive and the pipelines are very expensive. So if you look at the comprehensive cost of shipping LNG out of Canada, it's a relatively high up on the cost curve globally because the construction has been so expensive. And so that means that in order for these projects to ultimately make money, the price that they receive has to cover the full cost. That's the cost of the gas, it's the cost of liquefaction, it's the cost of the terminals themselves, the infrastructure, and the drilling. So when you look at the entire cost stack, Canadian LNG often does not necessarily price in that well against other lower cost projects around the world, particularly Qatar, which has the lowest cost LNG by far. So just to sort of um, dampen the idea that Canadian LNG is cheap just because the gas is cheap. LNG is expensive because the projects cost so much. And we'll have to see what happens to the prices. But basically, there is one price for LNG. The price for LNG is, well, I shouldn't say one price, but on spot contracts, they're all sort of basically keying off of the JKM, which is the Japan-Korea marker, sort of a spot marker that sort of determines how much a spot cargo is going to be still sell for in Asia. So the prices are sort of the same, whether it comes from the US, from Canada, from wherever, because it's, for the spot contracts, it's basically the same market. Pricing gets complicated. I don't want to talk about oil-linked contracts. Let's move on to another question. I just want to highlight that Canadian projects are expensive, and that bears remembering when thinking about cheaper LNG because gas prices are lower.
Great, thanks everyone. I'm going to choose an Asia-focused question for Sam. Why are utilities and brokers in Asia still signing long-term supply deals for LNG?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, the largest share of contracts signed with US LNG are not from Asian end users at all. They're from LNG traders and portfolio players that are looking to make a profit in any region that they can. That said, you still have, for example, Japanese utilities very active in the US market, more so in upstream segments. And we saw it in the trade deal announced yesterday in the gas-fired power generation segments in generation. But the question still stands: why are Japanese utilities buying US LNG at all if demand is falling? Well, what we've seen is that Japanese utilities are taking on a much more active role region-wide in Asia as resellers of LNG. They're actually not investing in new US LNG supply for their own demand. They have said themselves, from statements and corporate strategies, that they are targeting much higher opportunities in overseas markets reselling LNG. And that part of that means creating demand, investing in downstream power and LNG terminals in markets like Southeast Asia in an effort to stimulate demand. But the broader point is that US LNG contracts offer flexibility in terms of destination, and that's not necessarily a solid proxy for end use demand. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Anna Maria, we have a couple questions about what short-term diversification options in Europe might look like in terms of looking at different things that Europe can do to kind of move away from LNG. So if you could just speak, there's a couple questions about that. If you can maybe speak broadly to some of your ideas on what short-term diversification could be for Europe.
I think we are seeing a different Europe in 2025 than in 2026. 25, we saw a lot of pressure of investing more or signing more LNG deals, importing more LNG. This year, we have seen a bit of a shift on that. The concern in Europe is more energy independency, more on how can we be more competitive with our own resources, less dependency on other countries, on fossil fuels from other countries. So that has created a different scenario in 2026, where we have seen, like we saw, like the Hamburg Declaration, where that recently happened, that a lot of countries decided, let's build more wind farms in the North Sea. So they are seeing an opportunity. I think 2026, I see it as a great opportunity for Europe to turn again to what worked when we had another crisis in 2022. We had a huge crisis in 2022. We're importing much more gas from one source. And we were strong. We worked together on reducing gas consumption, diversifying sources. And the crisis at that moment could be managed. Okay, there were also other parts that it could have gone better, but was managed. And now I think we are facing another crisis. And the crisis right now is a wake-up call for Europe to realize that we cannot depend on any source, that we need to be stronger inside. And yes, for the moment, could be some short-term deals with other sources, hopefully not long-term contracts. But I think the course could be more alternative, clear options for Europe.
Great. Thank you, Ana Maria. Anyone else want to chime in on that one or next one? All right.
Well, I'm just curious, Ana Maria, I know you've sort of emphasized that conservation, efficiency, heat pumps, those kinds of things are essentially can be replacement for LNG imports. That it's not just a matter of finding new sources of gas, it's finding new ways of using energy more efficiently and ramping up homegrown renewables. Is that, I think, sort of that
Yes,
attitude still prevalent?
Yes, thanks, Clara. I think that's a great point. And definitely, yes, if we wouldn't have reduced by 20% the gas consumption, we would be importing even more LNG at this moment. And that is a reason why lots of the LNG terminals in Europe are underutilized, because also they were thinking, yes, we're going to be importing much more LNG. In some countries, yes, we have some countries that the LNG terminals are being very much utilized, but others could be 36%. We have realized in some countries that the biggest demand reduction was not in the industry, but on the households. So that indicates that if the households decreased so much the gas consumption, that was due to heat pumps, to demand side management, to lower 1 degree the thermostat in the winter. So all those activities that are controlled by the end user. So that's giving more autonomy also to the end user to do it. So yes, definitely has helped quite a lot.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, next question. If Pacific Coast LNG capex has more than tripled, are we observing temporary construction inflation or evidence that Western LNG mega projects are becoming structurally unfinanceable in a decarbonizing world?
Structurally unfinanceable. That's a hard question. So what we're talking about is the rapid and rampant cost escalation in Canadian, in particular Canadian projects. Although it's also true in Mexico. Some of the Mexican project, Energía Costa Azul, experienced significant cost overruns. So did New Fortress Energy's Altamira plant. In Altamira, the problems were the delays and cost overruns were so severe that the proponent is on the brink of bankruptcy. But in general, yeah. So what is the problem that I see is that what is financeable has changed based on politics. That there is still quite a bit of interest in building LNG terminals in Canada, but that interest is not based on sort of economic fundamentals whatsoever. It's based on more a desire to find a different route or a different outlet for Canadian gas. Right now, Canada produces more gas than it can use, and it has plenty of reserves in British Columbia and Alberta. It wants to monetize that, and it doesn't want to necessarily rely on the U.S. The problem that I see is that this is creating sort of like blinders about the crazy cost escalation we've already experienced, and we're going to continue to experience in most likely in Canadian projects. Uh, there is I think, a belief or a hope that somehow these projects are not going to have runaway costs, but time and again, we've seen it not just in LNG, but also in the Trans Mountain Pipeline that went wildly over budget, that cost billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies to get it through the finish line, and that ultimately, it's not clear that it was a good investment in the long run, but there's again desire to redo that to sort of create a new like sort of expand oil export capacity to the Pacific Coast. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in Canada, unfortunately, because of government support, there are projects that don't make any sense economically. They're too expensive. They don't necessarily serve growing markets, and yet they get pushed through for political reasons rather than for sort of based on sort of the financial benefits of the projects. I don't know if Mark, if you have any thoughts about this.
Not necessarily materially different from what you said.
I like that, Mark. Not materially different. Difference, but not
Great.
materially different.
Great. I think anyone can take this one. Generally, can you speak to how hard it is to change or modify or cancel a long-term offtake contract? For example, can Shell cancel a 20-year offtake contract, just write down the cost, or are they really locked in for 20 years? Do they shift or just try to resell it?
I can take that, but Sam, maybe you have a sense.
I can talk on the further downstream, but go ahead, Clark.
Well, so for an offtake contract from the US, these contracts are written pretty tightly. It is not easy for companies to cancel voluntarily a contract that they've signed with an off-taker. And generally speaking, what the penalty for canceling a contract would probably be so steep that they might as well just sort of like pay the liquefaction fees over time. That is my understanding of. I've read through some of these contracts, and they're pretty like the reason that an LNG terminal in the US can get financing, that can borrow money, is the strength of these contracts, and that you can't just back out on a whim. So once the contract is signed, once the sales and purchase agreement is signed, it's hard to get out. Now there are ways of getting out, but they're not really necessarily Shell deciding not to. So, for example, if there were legal restrictions put on exports or imports, that might be fall under a force majeure clause under some of these contracts. Some of the contracts do have an out called force majeure, which means basically an act of God, or that could be weather, it could be war, it could be government actions that sort of that basically stop the export of the activity at all. And so those can invalidate contracts. Another thing that can invalidate contracts is the bankruptcy of one of the counterparties. So if I don't think Shell is going to go bankrupt, but you may certainly see some of the smaller players who are buying US LNG go bankrupt. And in a bankruptcy proceeding, they will or they can choose to get out of contracts that are burdensome. So there are ways of getting out of it, but it's not like Shell can just say, "Nope, this is not working out for us. We're gonna walk." That's sort of like, if that had happened, these projects would have, if the bankers who were arranging these financing deals in the first place would probably have not been able to loan the money on such generous terms.
Yeah, further downstream, because a company like Shell signs US LNG procurement agreements, but then they sign sales and purchase agreements with downstream buyers. And in that case, for example, like a relationship between an emerging market buyer and Shell, we've noticed that we've seen in the past a clear imbalance between which counterparty is able to exercise which clause of the contract. And so, for example, during the height of the 2022 crisis, when Pakistan needed to import LNG from its contracted suppliers, those suppliers, Eni, and I believe it was Vitol, but I don't want to get that name wrong, they actually canceled shipments to Pakistan despite contractual obligations in order to chase higher price opportunities in Europe. They simply paid a penalty that was not large enough to dissuade them to reroute the cargo and sell it at a much higher profit to Europe. So what we've seen is that emerging market buyers can often have a much more difficult time getting out of contracts than some of the portfolio sellers. And this has put a major dent in the reputation of LNG in Pakistan, as well as a scare story for other emerging market buyers. Thanks.
That's right. In that case, again, the seller who is obligated to sell chose to break the contract and chose to basically say, okay, you want your money? You're going to have to sue us. You're going to have to take us to court. Rather than, so it was, they weren't fulfilling the contract, but they did have to, at least in theory, pay a penalty. But just the penalty was not enough to cover the additional cost that Pakistan and Bangladesh faced.
Great, thank you, everyone. We have a couple more minutes, so I think we can do one more question, and we've gotten a couple questions about glut, so I think if you all kind of want to chime in about that, but we can start with, are there particular, supply glut is a common topic. Are there particular countries that could prevent the supply glut from happening? For example, if countries in Asia do not successfully keep transitioning, or if the massive AI data centers are built. So maybe Sam, you could start, and if everyone kind of wants to chime in on that one, I think that could be a great closing question for us. Thanks.
For sure. It becomes very hard to say with absolute certainty that demand is going to continue to fall or demand is going to continue to rise. What we've seen is that in these major markets like China and India, actually the windows of opportunity in various sectors are closing. Now, that doesn't mean that they're fully shut. If prices do fall, there will be a demand rebound in Asia. It's a question of how much demand is going to rebound. Will it rebound enough to absorb those new supplies? Throughout South and Southeast Asia, gas to power projects are being delayed by limitations on infrastructure. So faster permitting, more multilateral funding for gas-related projects might spur an increase in gas to power demand going forward. That said, we're highlighting here major barriers to that being accomplished. And I think the risk is much higher than the industry likes to frame it as. Yeah, thanks.
There's a couple things to remember about with the glut. So it's just because we believe that a glut is likely, that there's going to be oversupply, and this is actually reflected now in, say, S&P Global has projected there's going to be oversupply from 2029 through, I think, 2036 now. Just a tremendously long period of oversupply. What that means is, well, somewhere around the world, there'll be some LNG terminals that will be turned on. And that more generally, it's going to mean, in a financial sense, that there are going to be people who are losing money on LNG. Those could be, in some cases, the LNG terminals themselves that were counting on higher price sales to sort of justify some of their initial equity investments. It could include the portfolio players who are buying LNG from the US and selling it at a discount in destination markets. It could include buyers in other countries, say European utilities that are buying high-priced LNG from the US when they could have bought much lower-priced LNG on the spot market. So the pain is going to be shared pretty widely across the entire spectrum. Some of it's going to fall on companies. A lot of it ultimately will be borne by consumers who are going to be paying higher prices for LNG than they ultimately would have paid if they just stayed away from these long-term contracts. One of the ironies is that some of the buyers, some of the utility buyers in Asia or in Europe, may be able to pass their high cost LNG purchases onto basically their captive consumers, the utility buyers, the buyers of electricity or natural gas, where the utilities purchase from the U.S. And so, ultimately, in this game, a lot of people, everybody's sort of playing with somebody else's money. And in the case of utility buyers of LNG who are going to be locked into higher price purchases, they're playing with their customers.
I just wanted only to add that data centers demand, yes, is expected to grow, but not as much as we are thinking. It's not that the biggest electricity demand is going to come from data centers. Actually, I was reading a report recently where it says like maybe around a tenth of the growth in global electricity is going to come from data centers. So when we see this, we cannot panic. We can, yes, there's a big demand coming there, but now also we know how to reduce demand. So if we continue with these two factors, we could manage it to this increase, yeah, and that won't be affecting that much the supply glut.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We are at the top of the hour. Again, I put my email address in the chat if people would like to follow up. I know there's still a lot of questions we didn't have time to get to, but if you reach out, we will do our best to follow up with you as quickly as we can. Thank you to our presenters for that great discussion and the great information. And thank you to everyone for your attention and your excellent questions. We really appreciate it. We'll be sending the webinar recording as soon as it is uploaded, and we hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.